my plan today is to talk for about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes now that I have more time, thanks Jeff. 10 to 12 minutes on my area of research with possible topics that might be of interest to you, and spend the remainder of the time talking about general career advice. Jeff told us to use a convex combination of advice and things that could help you along in the profession, so I'm happy to contribute from what I've learned. So my area of research is corporate governance. I particularly work on corporate boards and compensation structure, which could be thought of as internal governance mechanisms. And we have the expert on corporate boards here. Jeff has done enormous work. Mike is the leading expert on corporate boards here. But I will still try to say a little bit about corporate boards and compensation structure. I'm not going to talk much about given the time constraints. But two wonderful resources for anyone who is interested in this area or who's thinking of starting work in this area. The survey paper by Adams, Humberland, and Weisbach, 2010. Mike also has an earlier survey paper, but this is a wonderful thing to read before you get started on work in this area. And the series of survey papers by Kevin Murphy, absolute must read before you start work in compensation. So the literature on corporate boards has generally focused on four main areas. The first one is, what is the role of directors? What exactly do they do? What does the director do on the board? The second is on director incentives, not just the remuneration incentives, but also reputation, labor market incentives of directors. What motivates those directors? The third part of the research, which is a more emerging area, is about the director election process. How do these directors get elected onto boards? And finally, the part about board processes is something that would be wonderful to work on. It's something that we don't have a lot of data about, as I will talk about later. Of these, the first is the most well-developed area in the board's research. The other three, particularly the last two, are you have much fewer papers in this. In terms of the role of boards, the literature generally agrees that directors serve two important functions of the board. They serve to advise and they serve to monitor the top management of the firm. And the literature here has focused on identifying what board structure helps directors perform these roles effectively, and what individual director characteristics help directors perform these functions effectively. So for example, in terms of board structure, the early literature has focused more on the monitoring role of the board, and they have looked at things like board size. So the consensus is that smaller boards do a better job of monitoring the CEO and top management. More independent boards do a better job of monitoring the CEO and the top management. More recent literature has focused more on the advisory nature of boards, and the argument now is that bigger boards serve to offer better quality advice to the CEO, and more friendly or less independent boards serve to offer better advice. So you can see there's a trade-off between the advising role and monitoring role of directors. Other aspects of board structure that have been studied are co-opted boards. So I have a paper with Jeff and Naveen, my co-author. And we look at monitoring function of co-opted boards, and the idea here is that when the CEO nominates the directors, when the directors are appointed on the board after the CEO joins, even though the CEO is not directly on the nominating committee, the directors tend to be sympathetic to the CEO, and so when you have a greater fraction of directors who come after the CEO, the board is more sympathetic to the CEO. So this hinders their monitoring function. Busy boards, again, papers have studied whether busy boards help monitoring, and the argument is that busy boards hinder monitoring, and several papers have shown that busy boards reduce firm value because of this effect on monitoring. More recently, however, some papers like Michelle Lowry and Laura Field and co-authors have a paper where they show that boards are busy for a reason. The director gets invited to serve on other boards because he or she is an expert in a lot of different areas, because they have high ability, because there's a lot of qualifications. So busy boards, in fact, may offer better quality advice to the CEO. Similarly, stagnant boards, historically, it's been viewed to be reducing firm value because directors get more entrenched and the CEO gets more entrenched. But more recently, studied by multi-entrepreneurs and co-workers suggest that stagnant boards may not be detrimental to firm value, and in fact, they may even help in firms where you need to invest in projects with long-term payoffs. So you can see that the general focus of this literature has been advice versus monitoring and what board structures help directors perform these roles effectively. These studies have also focused on individual director characteristics. Again, directors, what is the financial expertise of directors? Do they have global expertise? Are they foreign directors? How do these qualifications, how does this background help directors do one or the other of their roles effectively? So this is a big literature in boards, and this is also a lot of recent papers out of this area. For example, supply chain expertise was a recent paper where they show that directors who have experience in the supply chain help firms in terms of providing better advice to the CEO. These papers generally have to infer something about why firms chose certain directors based on observing the characteristics and qualifications of these directors. But now, following a 2009 regulation change, firms have to disclose in their proxy statements exactly why they chose certain directors. Specifically, they have to say what particular experience, qualifications, or attributes of the director made the firm choose this particular director. So there are a couple of working papers that have emerged based on this data, but I still think this is an interesting data set to look at now that firms have to say in their proxy statement why they picked certain directors. This is certainly an area that would be potentially interesting to look at. In terms of director incentives, the literature has been, Yermak has a paper on, which is a very comprehensive paper on director incentives and director pay performance sensitivities. However, he was constrained because of lack of data on director, lack of extensive data, I should say, on director compensation. In 2006, again, a rule change forced firms to disclose much more details on director compensation. So again, now I see one or two working papers in this area, but I think still this is a potential area for a lot of work to be done because we have all this rich data now on director compensation. And if you think about CEO compensation, when there are about, I just searched on SSRN, and while this is probably overstating the case, there were about 1,600 papers came up on CEO compensation. And if you think about director compensation, there are just a handful of papers, again, mainly because of data unavailability until quite recently. The third area that's emerging quite rapidly is on director election process. Typically, most firms have, or traditionally they had, plurality voting. In plurality voting, a director wins an election if he or she gets more votes than any other nominee for that position. So in theory, in an uncontested election, and most elections in the US are uncontested, so in an uncontested election, a director could win even if he just gets one vote for the candidate, even if the majority of votes are withheld. And since 2005, activist shareholders have actually been clamoring or putting non-binding shareholder proposals for firms to, so this blue line is showing the number of, the percentage of proposals, how they passed. And this is for majority voting. They want firms to adopt majority voting guidelines. And majority voting is where a director will win the election if he or she wins the majority of the votes cast as opposed to a plurality of votes. And you can see that since 2005, this is the percentage of Russell 3000 firms that have adopted majority voting. It went from 0% in 2005 to about 40% in 2015. And this is the Russell 3000. If you look at the S&P 500 firms, more than 2/3 of S&P 500 firms have adopted majority voting in the last few years. And they've not just adopted majority voting, some have adopted variations of that. So for example, some have adopted plurality plus voting, where in plurality plus voting, the director wins the election. He is forced to resign if he or she doesn't get the majority of votes cast, but the board doesn't have to accept the resignation. Then in majority plus, The director is forced to resign if he doesn't get the majority of votes cast. The board accepts the resignation, but the director is held in place until the next year when elections happen again. So you have variations anywhere from plurality voting to majority voting with some variations in between. And I think there's a very interesting area to work on, again, because now you see all this new data and you see a lot of firms changing. So you can look at the characteristics of firms adopting majority voting, plurality plus voting, etc. What is the effect of this adoption on firms, firm policies? What is the effect of the failure to win votes on director turnover, CEO turnover, other labor market outcomes, etc. And there is work in this area, but I still think it's a very new area within boards. Fabrizio Ferri at Columbia Business School, he has a bunch of papers on this in his website if you're interested. And everywhere I drop the citation, the references to the papers in the interest of ease of presentation. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to go back and give you more references. The last part of boards that I'll focus on is board processes. So the way the board works to make strategic decisions, this is pretty much a black box. And this is obviously because we don't have data. We can't see the inner workings of the board. We don't have access to minutes of the board. So what we know about how boards function together as a team is very little. There are some exceptions. Again, Mike has a paper on the minutes of board meetings based on 11 Israeli firms. Alexander Lundquist and Corneli and another co-author have a paper on European firms that are transitioning from communism, from the communist economy. They have access to data on 473 firms, and they look at how these boards evaluate the CEO and what kind of data do the boards put together and what do they do with this information. So they have access to actual board intelligence. And more recently, there is data on Chinese firms in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. They have to publish whether directors dissented during board meetings. So there are other working papers now looking at director dissent and what kind of directors dissent, what are the labor market outcomes for directors of dissent. But generally, this is an area where you just have, as you can see, a handful of papers. So it's a very interesting area to work on. Jeff and I and Naveen Daniel, we have a paper on board groupthink. The idea is, again, the board is composed of individual directors, but these directors work together as a group. And so you have the normal group dynamics going on in this team. And we look at one particular aspect of this group dynamics, which is board groupthink, and look at the effect of board groupthink on firm value for different kinds of firms. In fact, we're presenting that tomorrow if anyone's interested in a Daniel session. So, as I said, by necessity, this talk was very brief. But I'm happy to meet you if anybody's interested. I'm happy to talk more about this during the break or the session. Now, I'm just going to change gear and talk a little bit about career advice. And I feel a bit of a fraud talking to you about career advice because I see the rest of this panel and I see myself, and I feel we are obviously much more qualified to offer you advice. But then I saw this cartoon by Dilbert quite recently, and I was thinking that maybe that's what Jeff wants me to do, you know. Maybe I'll talk about what you shouldn't do, and the rest of the panel can tell you what they did do to be successful. Kind of like, you know, do as I say, not as I do. So, at this point, all of you have more or less got your dissertation under control, and what you're looking for is getting a job, getting your papers published, and getting tenure. Not necessarily that order, right? You take tenure first. So in terms of getting a job, all of you are going to be interviewing here over the next few days or at the AFA meetings. So the most important thing is impressing people during the interview. And here, I cannot emphasize this enough. You have 10 to 15 minutes to talk about your job market paper. And you want to convince people that you know what you're doing and that you're fully confident that you have everything together. So I would say practice your talk. Write it down, memorize it, right? It's so important because you already are one of 15 people, you're one of 15 out of a possible pool of 150. Like Temple, we have a job opening, and I know that as of the beginning of October, we already had 150 applications for that position. So you are one of 15 already within that group, but you know people make their impressions quickly, so you don't want to spoil the first 10-15 minutes of the interview by searching for words or saying something wrong, just not sounding polished. So of course the trade-off is you don't want to sound rehearsed, you want to be able to memorize your talk, be very clear, not search for words at that point, but you don't want to sound rehearsed. And you also want to bring energy into the interview, because yours you may be talking to this school at the end of the day, maybe your 8th interview for the day, you're exhausted, they're exhausted too, they've been talking to candidates all day. So you want to still sound as though it's your first interview of the day, you still want to sound excited, you still want to sound energetic, so I think this is very important. So you've got the interview down, and you've been invited to the campus, right? And at this point, you need to practice your talk, practice your presentation. Get a bunch of other PhD students together, pitch it to them, pitch it to your family, it doesn't matter, just pitch it to yourself in an empty room. Practice your talk. Don't read from the slides, right? That is the most common rookie mistake, where people get nervous and you're more comfortable looking there, so don't read from your slides. And again, make your presentation easy to read. Don't put 20 lines into one slide. Slides are free. Spread it over, right? And you don't need to write down every word that you want to put down. You can just write down the point. The slides are just an area to help focus people's attention, focus your attention. And sometimes I see people, especially the rookie students, they put tables together, and then when they're presenting, they're saying, I'm not sure you can read all the numbers in the table, so let me read it for you. And if you're not sure the audience can read the numbers in the table, then you shouldn't be putting that table out there. Just put the key variables. You have more data, you have backup slides. If people care to know what is the effect of board composition on firm value or board composition with control variable, say, yes, I have that. That's slide number 42, that's my backup slide. But in the main regression, just show the variables of interest. And this is again a taste function. And actually, Jeff has put together a very nice collection of advice papers on tenure advice. I guess we'll be reading it at some point, Jeff. So, but you'll see some of these themes keep coming up in those too. This is a taste function, but if you put up a preview of results, say, and typically students preface this by saying, I may not get to the end of the paper, so here's my preview. And as Cochrane says, that becomes a strangely self-fulfilling prophecy, because the minute you put up a preview before you actually walk people through what you're doing and why you're doing it, people jump all over it, and that completely derails your presentation. And people walk away from the seminar with the idea that you didn't do enough or you didn't think it through. So again, this is, like I said, completely a matter of taste, but I wouldn't put it there. And importantly, don't get defensive. People have different ways of asking questions, but ultimately this is just academic intellectual curiosity. So take the suggestions as they are. Everybody wants the paper to be better, and you shouldn't get too defensive. You're completely open to comments about the paper and feedback about the paper. So once you have the interview in place, the next part is about getting published, and it's about effective writing. And so you start with your contribution, right? You can write pages about here's where the literature is at, and here's why I think I should be doing this. No, you start with your contribution and say, here is what I do. This paper looks at the effect of board groupthink on firm value. And then, why is this different? Well, because no one else has looked at board groupthink, and it's very important for us to understand the way board processes work. Why should anybody care about this? That's part of what you should be saying right there. And be concise. You see a lot of repetition. Sometimes you even see people copying, pasting parts of the info into their conclusion and into the abstract, etc. The more concise you are, the less risk you run of repeating yourself or doing this cut-paste in your paper. The other part that you should be careful about is in your writing is in terms of reading it, proofreading it again and again. And again, you'll see those in the papers that Jeff will hand you. They cannot emphasize enough how many times you should read the paper before you submit it somewhere is when you read a paper and you see simple typos, they'll be referring to tables which are not necessarily in the paper, or they may have been in an earlier version of the paper. Bad English, if you have to use a proof copy editor, do it, right? Copy editors cost you nothing in the bigger scheme of things. Another important thing is claiming more than you can in terms of the results. If your results don't support causality, don't say you have causality, say you just have an association, right? So claiming more than you can put there. And the idea is when the reader reads it and says, hey, the authors themselves don't care enough and they keep making these mistakes, why should I as a referee take it to the next step, right? So it's very easy to reject when you see so many mistakes staring you in the face. And you'll be surprised at how many people still have typos and they are so easily fixed. So then you've written it up, you've done a good job, and you're ready to send it off to a journal. But before you do so, I would say that first you should present the paper in as many venues as possible. And as PhD students or young assistant professors, you don't really have an opportunity to go present. You don't have the invitations to go present your work everywhere. But at least try to present it at the very minimum in your own school. And if you can, other schools have brown bags where they encourage this kind of early work. Try to get onto the brown bags, right? And try to get comments on your paper from your colleagues. This is again very important. I remember one of these doctoral student seminars where Jared Harford, who was on some of the editorial boards in the top journals, he was saying that when he looks at a paper and he sees that there's no acknowledgements of the paper saying thank you for comments from so-and-so and thank you for presentation participants at so-and-so school. If he sees that there's nothing like that there, he immediately thinks, oh, this paper is too early or this paper hasn't gotten enough feedback. So this is something, again, that's something to keep in mind. And if you do get a rejection, try to incorporate all the comments from the rejection before sending it. Treat it as a revision, revise your paper, and then send it to the next journal. Of course, you have to use some discretion in terms of what comments to address and what you do, but in general, don't just send it off to the next journal without redress. And in terms of the tenure process, so once you get your POPs, if you're a competent teacher and you've generally been a good citizen, this should help you get tenure. But some things to remember along the way, and this solo-authored work, or at least different co-authors. So this particularly affected me, I think, and my husband, because we, I don't know if, you know, I work a lot with my husband, almost exclusively nowadays with my husband and other co-authors. We have the pleasure of working with Jeff. We're not letting Jeff go, so a lot of our work is with Jeff. And you can see that even my name tag has Drexel University on it. I'm a Temple. So people start thinking of you interchangeably, and they don't know who's giving the contribution. With Jeff, there is no question about whether he has contributed or not, but when you're working, we are the et al., right? And when you're the et al., you have to be a little bit more worried about showing your contribution. So I made this mistake. Now I enjoy too much working with my husband, despite, don't tell him I said so. And I enjoy too much working with Jeff, so I don't think I would ever change this, but I think this is something you should remember, because when it comes time for your tenure documents, people look to see, oh, this person is always working only with their advisor, or this person is working only with so-and-so, so how do you know it's not contributing, things like that. So you might want to keep that in mind. And the other is the importance of focus. Again, it's easy to get distracted. All topics look interesting, sound interesting. People come pitching different ideas to you. And this is again something that I have suffered from in my effort to do work with other authors. I took on too many projects. Right now I'm working on so many different papers, and you seem to be always juggling papers, and everything's in the works. Nothing ever gets out of the pipeline. So this is something again that I would advise you to think on. There is an optimal span which varies from person to person, but make sure that you don't take on too many projects and everything suffers as a result of that. And another thing that I cannot emphasize enough, put effort into everything you do. Every time you're in front of people, even on a one-to-one, people are evaluating you. People are trying to assess what your potential is. So you may think, oh, this is just another discussion at the FMA. I mean, we know who attends these sessions, 10 people attend some of these sessions. So, I'll just wing it. No, put in your best effort, because there are always, people are looking at your effort, and you will always be rewarded for putting a high level of effort. And You will be penalized if you don't put in enough effort. People will say, oh yeah, that person I saw discussing and I wasn't too impressed. Same thing with referee reports. No matter what job or even paper reviews, do the extra step, go the extra mile in terms of any of this. And finally, the importance of networking. I think in terms of attending seminars, trying to meet people at the reception. It's a little strange at first because all of you are relatively new to the profession, so you don't know enough people, but over time you'll meet friends, you'll see the same people again at the same conferences. So make it an effort to go to the reception, meet people. You get invitations to seminars and discussions because people know you, they know your ability, they will talk to you. And when it comes time to writing those external letters for your tenure packet, people are more sympathetic to you on the margin if they've met you at conferences, so they can put a name on the face and say, oh yes, Lalitha, she does work on corporate boards. I don't know her very well, but I've met her at a couple of conferences. And on the margin, you tend to get a little bit more sympathetic letter, I feel, than if they have nothing to work with except your CV. Also, it brings great co-working opportunities. So this was generally all I wanted to say. I would like to wish you all the best as you embark on your career.
Thank you.